All right, it has been a moment since I reviewed a budget non-amber neck handheld on this channel. And here today we have the XU Retro XU20 V32. That is a bit of a mouthful for the model name, but let's dig in and see what this little handheld is all about. Right off the bat, a quick note on specs. We've got the all-winner A133P in here, which I believe is the same chipset that you see in the TrimUI brick and the TrimUI Smart Pro, so that's a known quantity. And then we have this 1024 by 768 3.2 inch screen. Again, same specs as the TrimUI brick, although this one is touchscreen, so we can actually tap on the screen here. It's running some custom version of Android with their quote-unquote Dawn launcher or Aurora launcher on here, which kind of gives you a Daijiisho-esque interface, although a bit more modified than we saw previously on something like the Magic X Mini 028, whatever the heck that thing was called. 3200 milliamp hour battery on here, and that all comes in at just 160 grams. It's plastic, it's a pretty light handheld, easy to hold, and not too big. We'll do some size comparisons later so you can get a better idea of how large it actually is. So what sets this apart from all of the other retro handhelds that have come out over the last couple of years? I mean, personally, I'm typically not excited for a vertical 3.5 inch-esque, although this isn't 3.5 inch, but that category of handhelds. We've seen so many of them. We've got Miu Mini Pluses, we've got RG35XXs, there's Pow Kitties, there's everything out there. So why would you pick this handheld over something else? Well, I think that really boils down to the all-winner chipset, which gives it a little bit more grunt than some of the super budget handhelds. And this screen is excellent. It's very bright and crispy and vivid. It's the screen from the TrimUI brick as far as I know, or at least it has the same specs. And I loved that screen on the brick, and I love it here as well. And perhaps best part of all is that it is cheaper than a TrimUI brick. So you get Android, you get touchscreen, you get that same spec of screen and processor, but comes in at maybe about $10 cheaper. And in fact, let's go ahead and just jump into pricing now and talk about where this stands on the market. All right, so in the time between originally filming this video and editing it, getting it ready for YouTube, the price on the site actually has dropped by $5 for the XU20. So we are now looking at $48 with the 64 gigabyte card. You probably don't want to buy the no card variant just because it does need a card to boot the OS, but if you want to do it yourself and get your own card, that's certainly an option, and you save about $5. So now after shipping, we are looking at $58, which is a bit more of an attractive price than it originally was, and it's about $15 less than the TrimUI brick. So yeah, keep that into consideration, and let's get back to the rest of the review. Well, if you did just want to get a TrimUI brick, then that goes for about $80 going rate at most sites before shipping. However, there are discounts to be found. I looked at this one on the Mech DIY site, and after a coupon, it was $72 with free shipping. So we're looking at what, 72 versus 63? It's about $10 more expensive for the TrimUI brick. Not a huge thing, and so if you prioritize the features of the TrimUI brick, and we'll talk about those later, then $10 more isn't that much. But if you don't like some of the things about the brick, then for $10 less, you can have this. So I think it does sort of have its niche in the market. It comes in this transparent black you see here, as well as 3 other transparent colors, a green, purple, and blue. Let's take a quick tour of the device and what is on it. Okay, so starting in the front, we've got our face buttons, our D-pad, our select and start, and then this is a fun one. See how it's lit up right now? That means that the D-pad is mapped to joystick. We just hold that down, the lights go off, and now it's just back to a regular D-pad. It's kind of a cool little trick, and we'll talk about that more in the retro emulation section. On the bottom, we have our charging port, and then on the top, we've got a headphone jack and a USB OTG port on there. And then on the left, we've got our volume rocker and our second micro SD card slot, which is currently unpopulated. On the right side, we have our first micro SD card slot. And then we've got the G button, which is sort of like a hotkey type button, and we'll showcase that a little bit later on. And on the back actually is where we have our power button. Not typical, but I guess it's not bad. It's kind of out of the way, you don't accidentally hit it. And our status light. Little vent here. There's no like active cooling. I guess this is just to, in theory, let some hot air out. And then of course we've got our shoulder buttons, and that is the overall tour of the device. As far as the finish and the feel, I do kind of like that we've got this a bit of a textured plastic kind of thing going on. So it does have a nice finish to it. It's smudge proof for the most part because of that texture. And so I do actually kind of like the plastic. It doesn't feel too cheap. Overall, I wouldn't say the handheld is the most premium feeling one I've ever held. And in fact, there's one thing that makes it feel and sound cheap, which is this. These shoulder buttons here are very loose and rattle. Now we could probably put some tape on them inside to get rid of that, but yeah, just a little bit annoying. The face buttons don't really rattle. If we hold those down, then we don't have an issue there. The buttons do feel pretty good overall, and we'll go into that more in the control section. So yeah, I think that the build quality is actually pretty good, and I'm not too concerned about this. It doesn't feel overly cheap other than those rattling back buttons. Okay, so first up with the face buttons here, we do have membrane, and this is one place where it starts to set us apart from the TrimUI brick. The brick has those dome switches, so for people that don't like that more clicky or dome feeling, this is going to give you a traditional membrane retro feel, and I do usually prefer that. They have a fair amount of travel. They could probably be slightly shallower, but I'm not offended by it. Feels pretty good, and they're a pretty nice size. They're not super small. In fact, if we look that next to the TrimUI brick, you can see that those are clearly larger buttons on this handheld. So yes, I do enjoy the face buttons. Those feel good. D-pad, similarly, it has a fair amount of travel, but yeah, you can wiggle it a little bit, kind of contra test style without getting diagonals, but it's also not too hard to hit the diagonals. So I would actually give this a pretty good rating on the D-pad here. I like it. It doesn't have any hard edges. I complained about that on handhelds like the brick where these corners were hard, but let's see if we can get a close-up here. You can see it's a very rounded edge on the D-pad. So I think a lot of thought went into the D-pad and face buttons on here, and I really appreciate that. Start and select are in a good location, and they're not particularly clicky, so that is also good. I already mentioned this toggle here, and I'll just show that off. If we press it and then we do the D-pad here, you can perhaps see that it's now rotating 8 ways on an analog stick simulator instead of the D-pad. So kind of cool for something like Nintendo 64. And let's just go ahead and turn that off. And then the back buttons work well. They have a click to them. They are a clicky button rather than membrane like the rest of it, but they are not a loud click. Let me do a close-up sound of that real quick. Very subtle, not annoying, so I definitely give those a pass. Now, on the topic of the buttons, there was an issue on the initial batch of these, and I'll put a video up on screen. Mine was actually affected by it, that if you press down too hard on the face buttons or D-pad, it would actually register shoulder buttons pressing. So on screen right now, you'll see that happening in my clip. But now, as you can see, I can press these down super hard, almost feel like I'm going to break it, and there are no shoulder button presses. So what do? They sent these little shim things. There are shims underneath the shoulders already, but these add little braces to the circuit board to keep it from flexing. And I'll put a picture of the before and after versions on the screen there from when I did that swap. If you buy it new now, you're gonna get the pre-fixed version, but if any of you were unlucky enough to order this before the fix, they should be sending you those replacement parts at no charge. If you do have that issue, make sure you reach out to whoever you bought the handheld through to make sure you get that fix. So yeah, non-issue after the fix, just a bit of a bummer that that got out of the gate through QC, but you know, good on them for fixing it and sending that out to customers. Kind of not so good on them that they're making the customer fix it instead of just exchanging the unit, but I understand shipping costs and stuff are challenging. Now that we've talked about the buttons and the feel, how does it actually feel to hold? Well, overall, it's pretty good. Like I said, I like this textured finish on here. It's smooth, it's pretty grippy, nice in the hands. It is a small vertical handheld, so it's not going to be the most ergonomic. And it lacks a bit of chin. There's not a lot of space between the buttons and the bottom. And let me grab something like the brick here, and you can see just how much more there is down here to grip on this. So vertically speaking, if you're going to hold it close with your hands tucked in like this, the brick might be a little better just because it's taller. But if you're holding it more spread out like this, then the XU is better because it's got a bit more to grip on the back and a bit more texture to it. So I think overall, I would say that for a vertical, the ergonomics are about what you'd expect and nothing particularly bad about them. Again, I will say some praise for the plastic finish and the rounded edges, making it overall comfortable to hit the buttons and no hard edges that can dig into your fingers. So since I have that out here, let's go ahead and do a couple comparisons between devices. So I've got the brick, which I've been talking about quite a bit, And then just for a larger class device, I'll bring out the Retroid Pocket Classic over here. This is the 6-button variant, but same size for both variants regardless. So, you know, compared to the Brick, you can see here it is a bit chunkier. It's actually overall almost identical in height. It's just that it has this bezel here which shifts the screen down lower on the device and therefore shifts the controllers lower and gives it less of a chin. Width-wise, it is wider than the Brick. You can see over here where my index finger is, that extra width. And again, let me see if you can see it in the lighting here. There we go, that there's a pretty thick bezel around the screen, and the Brick has a very narrow bezel. Now that may be because this has a touchscreen, so they need more bezel for the electronics. So I don't know exactly why. These are probably the same screen. It's just touchscreen, no touchscreen, bigger bezels, smaller bezels. So yeah, that's the size comparison there. And then looking at something bigger like the Retroid Pocket Classic, if you want to go more all out with the OLED screen, bigger screen and all that kind of stuff, then yeah, it's a fair bit bigger. The Classic is not really what I'd call a pocketable device. They are similar thicknesses. This is just much larger and even still a little bit wider. So this is still within the pocketable category, a little bit larger, a little less slim than something like the Brick, but I personally wouldn't have an issue tossing it into something. And then for a horizontal comparison, just because I happen to have this laying around, I've got the Retroid Pocket 2S over here, which is a 3.5-inch screen. And you can see that overall, the 2S, that horizontal device, is about the same width here, but significantly longer, so less pocketable. Of course, it's more ergonomic being a horizontal device, but you're using up a lot of space on both sides of the screen. Totally different class of device. This is a bit more expensive, a bit more powerful, but just so you know what a horizontal might look like compared to this one. So let's go ahead and take a moment to talk about the software. I mentioned this briefly in the beginning, but we have what's called the DOM launcher, which as far as I can tell is sort of originally based on Daijisho. When I had the Magic X Mini 028, it had a similar launcher. I think XU Retro and Magic X are maybe somehow related or share resources, but that one didn't have a touchscreen, which made this so much worse. Because, like, for example, if I want to turn this off, I just hold down the button, and now I can tap on power off. But on the Mini, you had to, like, navigate with this or do, like, a joystick to mouse kind of thing. So overall, better experience here with the touchscreen. You can interact with the UI, no problem on touchscreen here. And then of course, you can interact with the UI in RetroArch, or you can even run touchscreen Android apps or games on here if you choose to do so. So you've got your library, favorites, recents. I can go ahead here and you can see all the games that I've tested in the past few days here in my recents. And of course, in the library, we have all of the systems we can access, and then our standard interface where we can see our art and description on the right side and our games on the left. Overall, pretty functional software out of the box. I don't really have too much complaint about it, and it gets the job done. But there's one negative that I want to talk about, at least on this version that they sent me with the card included. And that's if we go over to apps here and then games, we've got Balatro and Dead Cells, Hollow Knight, Stardew Valley, Streets of Rage. Okay, like, I get it. We're playing devices that have ROMs on them that you should back up from your own collection. So yeah, it's already a gray area that they include ROMs on the card. But I think most people aren't going to get too upset about a 30-year-old game that you can't buy anymore being on the SD card. But that's not what we're looking at here. Balatro is a game that's out now, that has a developer now that should get paid for it. Same with Dead Cells, Stardew Valley, Hollow Knight. These are all modern games. And I think that there is where I kind of draw the line in the sand. And I do not think that we should be including these on the cards that come with handhelds, because we are taking away from people that are selling these games right now. These aren't abandonware, old software that nobody's making profit off of. If you put an MS-DOS game on here, I wouldn't care, but these are modern games. I personally own these games, so I didn't feel too guilty playing them, but yeah, it's still not really that great that we're doing this. That being said, let's go ahead and move over to our retro games and talk about that. Overall, the experience is going to be pretty decent on here. You're going to play maybe Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast as your top-end system. So let's go ahead and just go straight into Nintendo 64. And actually, let me go to my recents, pull up what I was playing the other day. And let's just say Star Wars Episode 1 Racer on here. Now, Nintendo 64 is not going to be a flawless experience. it is going to have slowdowns somewhat in some games, and of course the controls aren't optimal. You see flash on the screen here briefly, the C buttons are touch screen, and then of course we've got our joystick D-pad mapping toggle down here. So we're going to go ahead and turn the joystick on. As you can see, this is already not really running super smooth, although in-game it's not as bad. So let me quit talking for a second, get in game, and we'll cut ahead to that. All right, so now we are in game, and pay attention on the top left there. It's kind of hard to see, but we're varying 28, 25. I'm trying to look at this and look at the camera and play at the same time, so terrible. But yeah, it's not really maintaining a stable frame rate. That said, it's like playable and it's not that choppy, but in here we're stabilizing at a 30 frames per second, but it is going to vary depending on what's on the screen and what game you're playing. So Nintendo 64 is certainly playable. This joystick mapping feature is kind of nice, but in a game like Pod Racer here, to go sideways, you actually have to use the C buttons. It's kind of awkward to try to do that on the screen while you're playing. Of course, you could remap some controls, maybe use the X and Y buttons here as 2 of your C buttons, depending on the game. But yes, we do at least get that joystick mapping that makes Nintendo 64 at least some games playable. How much fun you have with that's going to depend on the game and how dependent they are on probably the C buttons. So yeah, it definitely runs, and it's not terrible. It's in a pinch gonna play some Nintendo 64, but that's kind of like the hardware limit that we're looking at today. And on the G button on the right here, I think is functioning as a back button, at least in this app, so we can go ahead and tap that to bring up our MovePin 64 menu. We can exit there as well. If you hold down on the button, it'll kick you all the way back to the launcher. So let's check out something that is not gonna stress the system, and we'll pull up a PS1 game. All right, so we got PlayStation 1, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 here. I'm currently on enhanced resolution, so 2x resolution on PSX on this RetroArch core, and it is running decently. There's a couple times where it's going down into the 50s on frame rate, depending on what's on screen, but yeah, it is running okay. Let's toggle that back to standard though. So to enter our settings in RetroArch, we just hit our G button here, and it brings up our quick menu. Let's go down to core, GPU plugin, and we'll turn off the enhanced resolution, and then we'll go back to our game. And then yeah, now of course it's a little rough around the edges, although still fine. It's just original PS resolution. And now we are running at a rock solid 60 and no longer compromising on the frame rate at all there. So it's just going to depend on game. You can run some of them at 2x, but it's going to run all your PlayStation games at 1x without too much issue. So yeah, totally capable there on the system. And then of course, it goes without saying that we're going to be able to play any of our retro systems, Super Nintendo, Game Boy Color, all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to spend a lot of time showing that off because you already know what that looks like on a handheld probably. Real quick, let's just go over to those games. Again, not a fan of this being dubiously acquired on here, but let's boot up Dead Cells to do 2 things: to test how Android games work, and then we'll also listen to the audio on the handheld. So as you just heard there, the audio is audio. What can I say? It's a small mono speaker. It sounds okay. Not super tinny, not robust. It is just a small handheld speaker, but gets the job done for retro. But now let's take a look at how Dead Cells plays on here and how Android performance feels. All right, so spoiler alert, it doesn't run super well. I don't know if you're gonna see it on the 30 frames per second display here, but it is definitely chunky to play Dead Cells, at least with these settings. Now, I believe there's a resolution setting, so let's take a look at that and see if it improves. We're gonna go Start, Settings, Video. Let's turn the FPS cap off, high resolution off. Ugh, it looks rough, but let's see how that plays. Nah, we're still not playing super smooth, and it looks worse. So I kind of find it curious that they included Dead Cells on here in the first place, seeing as it doesn't really run well. So yeah, curious inclusion. But yes, Android games work. Don't expect a lot of power and performance out of it for an Android game. So that about sums up my thoughts on the XU Retro XU30 V32. It is sort of a budget TrimUI brick alternative. It's also a good alternative for people that don't want the dome switch buttons and want a traditional membrane feel. And I would say that maybe I kind of like the D-pad more than the brick. It's more comfortable, larger, and good old squishy membrane, but that's a personal preference thing. It's a little bit cheaper depending on sale prices. It may be closer to the TrimUI brick than you think, but it can obviously vary depending on where you get it and what sales are going on, what kind of tariffs you have to deal with, and shipping costs. Android does provide some alternatives as well to something like the TrimUI brick, because you can load up other stuff. Dead Cells didn't run great, but I am sure there are other games that will run better on here. And then you get more emulator options with Android as well on top of RetroArch. So if you're somebody that prefers Android, maybe you want to use syncing, and that is easier to do on Android, then those options are definitely there. Overall, a fairly well-built small handheld, and I think I can definitely recommend it if you're looking at around this $60 price point for a vertical handheld, and maybe you decided the brick wasn't for you, but you liked the screen on it, then this is definitely a viable contender. So yeah, that is really all I have to say. Have a good one, and thanks for watching. Do those YouTube things like comment, subscribe, and catch you next time.